Hi everybody, and thanks very much for joining our webinar today on everything you need to know about non-resident tax. So my name is Elvera King and I'm an account manager here at Sprintex, but I'm also joined by my colleague today, Neil Duffy.
Hi everybody, thanks for joining us today.
Great, so the aim of today's session is to help you understand the basic principles of non-resident tax and to make you aware of your tax filing obligations so that you're all set for the 2020 tax filing season. So let's get started. So in terms of an overview then of what we'll cover in today's session. So we'll look at an overview of tax for non-resident students and scholars, the basic principles that you need to be aware of. We'll look at the implications of not filing or misfiling. So maybe you've been in the US a number of years and you haven't done anything at all, or maybe you filed incorrectly in previous years and filed as a resident instead of a non-resident. So we'll look at what you need to do in those situations. We'll then have a look at using Sprintex to assist with tax compliance, and then we'll open up to any questions or discussion at the end. So we will have some time left at the end for any questions. So in terms of important dates for the 2021 tax filing season, the tax year runs the same as the calendar year. So it's looking back at the period from January 1st to December 31st, 2021. And we're looking at any income that you've earned during that period, any taxes that were withheld on that income, and any days that you've spent in the US. So we're looking to figure out if you've over or underpaid tax to the IRS or the state authority during the 2021 tax year. Now, another really important date is the filing deadline, which is Monday, April 18th, 2022 for the 2021 tax year. So really important that you do have your return submitted before that date. Now, we will discuss in a little more detail later. The option to e-file on federal returns will be available to many of you, but for those who that option is not available to, or for anybody that still needs to physically mail those documents, or maybe if you're mailing them from outside the US, do ensure that you allow ample time for those documents to arrive with the relevant authority by that filing deadline. So one of the first topics that we need to look at when we're looking at non-resident tax is residency for tax purposes. And the concept of residency for tax purposes can be confusing. So hopefully today we can clarify that a little. We'll break it down and hopefully everyone will understand it a little better after today's session. So firstly, it's important to mention that residency for tax purposes is completely independent of your visa or immigration status. So although you may be non-resident on your immigration status, you could actually be resident for tax purposes. Because when it comes to resident versus non-resident for tax, it's all based on the number of days that you've actually spent in the US. So generally, most international students or scholars on F, J, M or Q visas are considered non-resident for tax purposes. But the rule that the IRS follow is that if you're a J1 or an F1 student, generally you're considered non-resident for the first 5 calendar years here in the US. After that 5-year period, then the IRS will look at what's known as the substantial presence test. So the substantial presence test then, it's essentially looking back over the previous 3 years, and it's looking at your days of presence to determine your residency status. So it would look at all of your days of presence in the current year. It would take 1/3 of your days of presence in the year before that, and 1/6 of your days of presence in the year before that. And if that totals to 183 days or more, then you would be deemed resident for tax purposes. Now, if you're considered resident for tax purposes, Sprintex will not allow you to proceed any further than step 1, as you would need to use a resident provider like our resident partner TurboTax. But the good news is you don't need to do the calculations. Sprintex will work all of that out for you. So all you need to do is to complete your details in step 1. So we'll ask you for your entry and exit dates there in the very first section of the website, and we'll work out then if you're resident or non-resident for tax. Now, you'll have heard me mention a calendar year there. So just for example, if Neil entered the US on December 30th, 2021, but his semester at his university didn't start until February 2022, the IRS would actually count 2021 as Neil's first year of presence in the US, even though he's only spent 2 days in the US in 2021. So just to be aware of that. So residency rules then change slightly for researchers or scholars on J visas. So if you're a researcher or scholar on a J visa, instead of that 5-year grace period where you're considered a non-resident, you actually only get 2 years. And after you've been in the US then for 2 years on a J scholar or research visa, the IRS will then look at the substantial presence test. So just a quick summary slide then on the different visa types, the number of years that each visa is exempt from the substantial presence test, and whether there's a FICA exemption available based on that visa type. Now we will share, as I said earlier, a recording of today's session, and we'll also share the slides in the handout section. So you will be able to have a look back over these in your own time later if you'd like to do so. So looking then at who must file for 2021. Every non-resident needs to do something when it comes to tax filing obligations. An absolute minimum then, all non-residents need to file at least Form 8843, which I'll go through in a little more detail in the next slide. But you need to file Form 8843 irrespective of whether you've earned income or not during the tax year. Now, Sprintex will prepare the relevant forms for you, including Form 8843. So once you fill in your details through the questionnaire, we'll work out exactly what it is your requirements are, and we will prepare those relevant documents for you. Now, in many cases, you may have been receiving taxable income during the tax year. So, for example, you may have had an on-campus employment and you've received wages from that, or maybe you received a taxable stipend or grant or allowance. And in the eyes of the IRS, that would be considered taxable US source income and would trigger a federal filing requirement. Now, as a result of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act back in 2017, the personal exemption has been abolished. So now, if you earn anything over $0, it's generally taxable and would be reportable on your tax return. So previously, you could have earned up to a certain amount before you would trigger a filing requirement, but now, from the very first dollar, you will trigger a filing requirement with that personal exemption being scrapped. Also, just an update on the 1040 NREZ. That form has been discontinued from last season. So there may be some of you on today's session who recognise 1040 NREZ. Maybe you filed that in the past. But just to be aware, that form is no longer available, the EZ version. So it's just the 1040 NR going forward. But again, you don't need to worry about the forms. Sprintex will prepare the relevant forms for you. So what is Form 8843? Well, like I mentioned, it's a minimum filing requirement for all non-residents in the US, and essentially it's a declaration of your non-resident status for the tax year. Now, it's a pretty straightforward document, so it'll request details like your name, your address, the type of visa you're on, and the number of days that you've spent in the US. And by giving that information then, you've completed your obligation for Form 8843 filing. So also important to note that Form 8843 is also known as a statement for exempt individuals and individuals with a medical condition. So what on earth is that? Well, I suppose if you think about it just as a declaration of your exemption. So say, hi, my name is Elvera. I'm an F1 student in my first year in the US. Please don't count these days of presence towards the substantial presence test as I am still an exempt individual. So looking then at the types of income that the IRS would consider taxable US source income and would trigger filing requirement. So you've got obviously your most common would be your employment income, so your wages or your salary. Maybe you've got a scholarship covering costs other than tuition or tuition related expenses. So maybe you've got a scholarship that covers room and board, or maybe transport to and from school. Maybe you've got investment income or you've invested in cryptocurrency. All of that would be considered taxable US source income and will trigger a filing requirement. Then other types of income may be less common. Maybe you've been to Vegas at the weekend and you've won on the slot machines. That would be considered taxable income and would be reportable. Maybe you've attended a focus group and you've received an Amazon gift card in payment for that. Or you've got an apartment in New York and you've rented out a room on Airbnb for over 14 nights. Or maybe you're an artist and you're selling art or design works. All of that would be considered reportable. It's taxable US source income and would be included in your non-resident tax return. So we've mentioned income that triggers the federal filing requirement. Now let's have a look at those that are exempt from triggering the filing requirement. And the good news is there are a few of these. So the first is a scholarship for tuition and tuition-related expenses. So here I'm going to give you an example of a sports scholarship. So if you're a student on a sports scholarship that covers tuition, but maybe also covers your room and board, like I mentioned a minute ago, or in some cases your transport to and from school, because that scholarship covers areas that are outside of tuition, that is a taxable scholarship and it's considered income. But if that scholarship covers just your tuition, then the IRS are not concerned with it and you don't need to include it on your tax return. The second point here then relates to scholarships received from outside the US. So if you receive a scholarship from your home country to travel to the US to study, the IRS will not tax this, because although it may be taxed in your home country, it's not US income, so they won't be interested in that and you don't need to claim it on your tax return. So you may have noticed from my accent that I'm from Ireland. So if, for example, Trinity College in Dublin decided to send me to New York to study for a semester, the scholarship that I received from Trinity College in Dublin, it's not something that I need to include in my non-resident US tax return. It is something that I likely pay tax on back home in Ireland, but I don't need to include it in my non-resident US tax return. Points 3 and 4 then are similar in that although you may be taxed on these overseas, the IRS are not concerned with it when it comes to filing your non-resident tax return, and you don't need to claim it. Similarly then, if you've worked in your home country before arriving in the US and you bring this money with you, again, it's not US source income, the IRS are not concerned with it, and you don't need to claim it on your tax return. And finally then, we have interest on regular savings accounts here. And it's important to point out that for most international students, if you have a regular Chase or Bank of America account, for example, then that's going to be tax exempt and the IRS won't be concerned with it. But if you have the likes of a fancy JP Morgan investment account or a Robinhood account that's accrued a lot of interest each year, in that case, the IRS may be concerned with that. And certainly if you're making a gain on that investment account, there's a high chance that you will receive an income document for that account and you will need to claim it on your tax return. But for most standard accounts, you don't need to claim it. So let's have a look then at some of the income documents that you could receive. So the first is a W-2 document, and Form W-2 is really the most popular document that you could receive. So it relates to your wages, relates to salary or compensation, and it would include details of income that you've earned and any tax that was withheld on that income. And you could also receive multiple W-2 documents if you've had multiple employers. So just to be aware of that. So for example, if you worked for 2 different employers in 2021, you'd expect to receive a W-2 from each one. Now, typically the deadline to receive your W-2 is January 31st, 2022 for the 2021 tax year. Now, the second document then is the 1042S document, and this document applies mostly to taxable scholarships, stipends, any royalty payments, prizes, any tax treaty exempt income. It would all be typically outlined on a 1042S document. So we'll go back again to the sports scholarship I mentioned a little while ago. If your scholarship is covering anything outside of tuition or tuition-related expenses, then you will receive a 1042S for it. But if your scholarship is not taxable, then you wouldn't expect to receive that document. The deadline to receive your 1042S document is March 15th, 2022, again for the 2021 tax year. And the final document then is the 1099 series, and that covers everything that's considered miscellaneous income. So miscellaneous income may be rental income from a property that you've had on Airbnb. And in such case, if you've received income from Airbnb, then they will issue with the 1099 series document. Also, if you had an investment account and you've made a gain on that, there's a high chance that your broker or the person that you've made your investments with will issue with the 1099 document. Also, commissions are under the 1099 umbrella, but the most popular one would be independent contractor services. So typically, if you're working independently and not as an employee of a business, but as a contractor, you will receive a 1099 at the end of the filing year. So the next thing we look at then is your spouse and dependents and how they should be treated when it comes to tax. So the IRS are pretty stringent on how your spouse and dependents should be treated. So if they've never worked at all and they've had no income, then they still need to complete that Form 8843, similar to you. But if they have received any income, then they will trigger a federal filing requirement. And if they're in a state where there's state tax, they may also trigger a state filing requirement. So they basically have the same rules as you, the visa holder. Now, also worth noting that non-residents cannot file a joint return with their spouse. They must be filed separately. However, if you're a non-resident and you're married to a resident, you can elect to file jointly on your spouse's resident tax return, but we would recommend doing the math on both options first to see which option would be more beneficial to your tax position. Moving on then to FICA taxes, and what is it? So I suppose if you're in the US at the age of 65 and you need assistance paying your medical bills, FICA tax would assist you with that. But the thinking is, as a non-resident international student, the chances are you're not going to be in the US at the age of 65 to benefit from that. And for that reason, there's a general rule that if you're on a J1 or an F1 visa, you're exempt from paying FICA taxes. But in a lot of cases, your employer may not be aware of this, and they may treat you the same as they would a resident who does need to pay FICA taxes. So what we'd suggest here is just to check your W-2. There is a section on there that says FICA or Social Security or Medicare, and if tax has been withheld, and if you're on one of these visa types, so if you're on F1 or J1, then you should firstly ask your employer for a refund. But if they're not willing to issue the refund, then definitely submit a FICA return through Sprintex via Form 843 or 8316, because you will get all of that back. Next, then, we have state taxes, and state tax rules will differ from state to state. So some states will say that you only need to file if you earn over $8,000. Some will say over $17,000, for example, whereas others will say that you need to file from the very first dollar. And of course, there are some states where there's no state tax. And it can also depend on things like your visa type, the number of days that you've spent in the state, and even down to the type of accommodation you've lived in. It can be quite complicated, with the state rules varying from state to state. But again, that's not something that you need to worry about. Sprintex will work all of that out for you. Once you fill in your details through the questionnaire, we will determine whether you've got a state filing requirement or maybe multiple state filing requirements, and we'll prepare those relevant forms for you. So next we have ITIN, or Individual Taxpayer Identification Number. So an ITIN essentially applies to those students who have a filing requirement, whether that be federal or state, but are not eligible to work in the US. So who might that be? Well, let's go back again to the sports scholarship. They may not be eligible to work in the US, but because their scholarship is considered income, they will trigger a federal filing requirement, and in that case, they'd need to apply for an ITIN. So if you have a social security number, you don't need an ITIN. It's just for those who have a filing requirement but are not eligible to work. Now, if it's a case that you only have a Form 8843 filing obligation, so if you haven't received any income at all and you just need to submit Form 8843, in that case, you don't need a social security number or an ITIN for that. So if it's Form 8843 only, you won't need either of those numbers. Now, the ITIN application process can be a little tricky. You can apply for it with your tax return, and in this case, the application form would be the W-7, and your documents would need to be certified by a CAA, or Certified Acceptance Agent. And they're generally registered with the IRS, so it can be done at your local IRS office as well. The second option then would be to apply for your ITIN ahead of the tax return process. And in this case, again, it's the W-7 form, and you need to have your document certified by the RO, or responsible officer at your school. Next then, we have Form 1098T, and this is a really important slide because it is the #1 form of misfiling every year for non-residents. So Form 1098T applies only to residents, and it's an educational tax credit of $1,000. So if you were to go to a website that prepares taxes for residents and you say you've received 1098T, or you've received this form from your school in error, you could actually get a $1,000 tax credit. But as a non-resident, you're not entitled to receive this. And if the IRS realise that you've claimed this tax credit, not only will they look for that $1,000 back, but they could also apply fees and penalties. So just to be really careful on that. Also, if you filed as a resident and you've claimed the educational tax credit and other resident tax credits, it's likely then that you've also received the stimulus check, and that too would need to be returned. So we'll look into that in a little more detail now in a couple of minutes. So next then we're moving on to filing incorrectly and the stimulus checks. So I suppose you may be sitting here listening to the webinar today and you're thinking, okay, well, I've been in the US for the last number of years, but I've never done anything at all. Or else I filed last year, but I filed as a resident and I filed incorrectly. Well, the first thing we'd always say is don't panic, but do set the record straight. So if you've never filed at all, we'd say definitely catch up. And the good news is that if you're due a refund in the last 3 years, the IRS will actually issue that to you. So there could well be money sitting there with the IRS waiting for you to collect. But on the other hand, if it's a case you owe the IRS money, there's no cut-off point. They will expect you to go back as far as necessary if it's a case you owe money to them. Now, if you filed incorrectly, so you filed last year maybe as a resident instead of a non-resident, what you need to do then is to go back and file an amended tax return, so a 1040X, an amended US individual income tax return, and a correct non-resident tax return, the 1040NR. Now that is something that Sprintex can assist with. So if you do need help with either going back and preparing returns that you haven't filed in previous years, or preparing an amended return, both are something that Sprintex can assist with. So looking at the stimulus payments then briefly, I know this is probably not a hugely hot topic at the moment. It's something that happened at the beginning of the pandemic, but just to have a quick refresher on it. There may still be people on today's session that it might affect, and it might be of use to them. So we've seen the stimulus check make the headlines across the US and across the world, with people receiving that stimulus check in error. So we saw a lot of non-residents who'd filed incorrectly in the past and filed as a resident, and as a result, they've received that stimulus check in error. And we're wondering, okay, well, why did I receive the stimulus check? Am I entitled to it? And if I'm not entitled to it, then how do I go about returning the stimulus check to the IRS? So I suppose in short, you won't be entitled to the stimulus payment if you're a non-resident alien for tax purposes. The payment was intended just for US citizens and resident aliens who are not eligible to be claimed as a dependent on somebody else's income tax return, and that they have a valid social security number. Now, there are lots of additional resources and additional information available on the IRS website that gives further information on eligibility criteria. But in short, if you're a non-resident alien for tax purposes, then you won't be eligible for the economic impact payment. So what are the actual implications then of not filing? So I suppose the one we've highlighted here and the one we'd always continue to emphasize is the impact that it could have on your future immigration status. So, you may be looking to stay in the US or maybe looking to apply for a change of status in future, for example, and it is very likely that you will be asked for evidence of tax compliance in your visa interview. So we'd hate to see tax being something that would prevent anyone from staying in the US. So with that said, it is so important that you are tax compliant and that your tax returns are up to date for every year that you've been in the US. Additionally then, if it's a case that you owe money to the IRS, there's a high chance that they will apply fees and penalties, and interest can accrue on that. But I suppose in a lot of cases as well, you may actually receive a refund back. And the only way that you'll receive the refund is through submitting your tax return. But I suppose also, as a non-resident, you're required to comply with all US laws, including IRS and filing tax forms, even if it's only Form 8843. So it is part of your visa conditions. So really, really important that you are up to date on your tax filing for every year you've been in the US. So next then we'll have a look at using Sprintex and a look at what Sprintex looks like as you sit down to prepare your taxes. And Neil, I might hand over to you for this section if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Elvera.
No problem.
Perfect. So we're going to have a look at the actual Sprintex software and what to expect when you go in to do your taxes. So the very first screen you'll see here is the email that you'll receive from your school or institution. And once you receive this email, you'll see that there's a couple of data points on it that will be important for you to do your taxes. The first is information on basic information on what your obligations are. The next is a registration link that you can click on, which will bring you to the Sprintex website. And then the other point will be the actual the information on how you receive your institution discount. So it's very important that you read that email very clearly, because the instructions will change from school to school. But once you click on the link, it will bring you to the login page for Sprintex. So here, if you already have an account with Sprintex, you can go in, you can enter your email address and your password, and that will bring you to the very first page. But if you're new to Sprintex and you haven't used us in previous years, you can go in, you can register an account with us by giving us your first name, your last name, your email address, and a password. So that then will bring you to the very first section of Sprintex, and that is the Residency Section. And you've heard Elvera mention how important it is for you to know if you're a resident versus a non-resident. Well, this is how you would actually figure that out. And I guess during filing season, we get a ton of questions from users asking us to advise if they're a resident or a non-resident. And our response would always be the same. It is that this section of Sprintex, step 1, will be the decider of whether you're a resident or a non-resident. So we're never going to make that determination for you. Once you fill out this section, once you enter your entry and exit dates, the software will advise you specifically if you're a resident or a non-resident. If we find that you're a resident for tax purposes, we'll stop the process. A pop-up box will appear, and we'll advise you that we recommend you use TurboTax. If we find that you're a non-resident, we'll allow you to move on to step 2. So again, just to confirm, if anybody has any specific questions, looking for us to look at their dates that they were in the US over the last number of years, we wouldn't be able to look at that unless we got out a pen and paper and did the maths. So the easiest way to do it is to really do step 1 of Sprintex. So once we find that you're a resident, then you can move on to step 2, which is the income document section. So here we ask you what income documents you received throughout the year and the quantity for each document. So if you advised us that you received one W-2, maybe a 1042S, maybe also a 1099, we'll give you a blank template for each of those documents. So once you see that blank template on the screen, you can either enter the information manually from your income document, or else you can upload it, excuse me, using our OCR, or optical character recognition technology. And if you use our OCR technology, you can simply upload a copy of your document, and the fields that we need will pre-populate for you. And then once everything is entered, again, you can move on to the next step. Next up then, we'll look at state taxes. So here we'll ask you for the states that you lived in throughout the year, the dates that you lived in each state, and then the type of accommodation. So if you lived in New York for the first 6 months, and then maybe you moved to Massachusetts or maybe California, you would enter those dates here. And again, it's only for the 2021 tax year. For the state tax section, outside of that, we're not really interested in any other information. Here's a useful tip for filling out the state tax section. I would always open up the residency section on step 1 while you are completing the dates for the state tax section. Because if you left the US for any amount of time during 2021, that will also need to be reflected in the dates you put into the state tax section. So those dates do need to be specific in order for the system to accept it. So after this then, we will look at the states you've lived in, we'll look at the income that you received, and then we will advise you if you've met any of the thresholds for a state filing requirement. So the example we used here is a New York filing requirement. So here you'll see we'll advise you that you've triggered that filing requirement and you can add it to your cart. So at this stage, you've done the hard work, you've entered all the information online, and now you're at the order review section. So here you'll see the cost of a federal return, the cost of a state return, and then any additional products that you've entered via the Sprintex website. Now again, some schools will have a code that they can enter here. Some schools might have a link, but either way, the information on how to receive your institutional discount will always be included on that initial email you receive from your institution. So once you have received that discount, you can then move on to the next step. So the next step is to actually view your documents. So if you're eligible for e-filing, we will advise you on the actual screen here. Now, unfortunately, not everybody is eligible for e-filing, and this is an IRS rule. So for instance, if you have an ITIN, you're not eligible to e-file. You do need a social security number to e-file. If any of the names on your social security do not match the information you entered, then you won't be eligible to e-file. If your W-2 doesn't have a control number, which is a number your payroll office enter on the W-2, then you won't be able to e-file. The same with your 1042S. There's a unique identifier on the top of each 1042S. If yours doesn't have one, then you won't be eligible to e-file. If you earned any income outside of the US, if you earned capital gains income, maybe you received a 1099 NEC or a 1099 miscellaneous with box 4 higher than 0. In all of these cases, unfortunately, the IRS do not provide e-filing as an option to you. So if you are eligible to e-file, you'll see the options on screen. You can click the button confirming that you want to e-file. You can click proceed to e-file. If you're not eligible, then you can download your documents and follow the on-screen instructions. And just a reminder, you can only e-file for some federal returns. State returns will always need to be physically printed and mailed to the IRS. Here's an example of what the actual physical document looks like. You'll see that we provide you with an instruction sheet and a cover sheet. We'll advise you the specific documents to attach. We'll advise you exactly where to sign, and then you can physically print it off and mail it to the address that we provide to you via the instruction sheet. And you'll do that for both federal and state taxes. So other supports then that we offer. So first off, have a look at our YouTube channel. We do have quite a few educational tax videos that cover the most common tax scenarios that our live chat team sees. We also do the same for our blog. So again, Elvera mentioned the stimulus payments, topics such as that are trending. We would always release a blog article that has an additional amount of information included. We do have 24/7 live chat. So if you're going through the Sprintex process and you're not sure how to answer certain questions, the live chat team can certainly assist you with that. First off, we'll try to answer your question via Stacy, which is our live chat bot. But after that, there's a full team available to assist you. We also have Sprintex Forms, which I'll discuss briefly in a couple of slides. And then obviously we have our tax workshops and webinars that you're currently on. We do have a number of webinars scheduled throughout filing season, so please feel free to check your school's schedule. So very briefly, one of the other softwares that we do have is called Sprintex Forms, and this is a pre-employment software. So if you're going on OPT or CPT and your employer has requested you fill out your employment forms, so that could be W-4, it could be a W-8 Ben, it could be an A233, and you're not quite sure how to fill them out, Sprintex Forms can assist you with that. So by going in, filling out the online questionnaire, we'll prepare these documents for you, so only the correct amount of tax is withheld. If you have any tax treaties, these forms will also advise your employer of such. So again, it just makes sure that you're taxed correctly from the get-go and you are not overtaxed or undertaxed throughout the year. So that's it. That kind of covers everything. First off, from a tax principles perspective, then looking briefly at the actual Sprintex software.